Hey, what's going on, guys? Part 3. So, I know I felt kind of bad. I said, oh yeah, part 2, we're gonna finally do some programming, and we never actually got around to it. I just kind of explained some basic syntax things here. But this time we're officially gonna get our hands dirty, okay? So I remember last time I said that the start is called once level is loaded, and update is called every frame. So let's go ahead and start by writing our first little piece of code within this start function here. Okay. Um, so this is where using our Unity Engine DLL comes in handy. There's a bunch of methods that are available for us. So start by typing in debug, and if you did follow my recommendation and download Visual Studios, it should have this window pop up where you can easily choose and auto-complete your text. Debug, which is a class that Unity Engine already comes with. Dot log, and then on the inside of these parentheses here, let's put hello world. That's always the first string that any programmer usually starts with. Hello world. Okay? So let me explain a little bit of syntax just for a single line here. So debug is a class, just like test is a class, but it's inside the Unity engine. Now, if you use the dot, it's accessing something inside of that class. So there's a method inside of debug, similar to how start is a method inside of test, that when we're passing the string value into that method. So you're probably wondering why I use quotation marks here, if you're new to programming. The reason for that is if I just typed in hello world like this, when I compiled this, it wouldn't make any sense, and you'll notice there's like red underlining because Visual Studios helps us out that way. It's because it's trying to convert this to code, and that's not what it is. It's a string, and what a string is any amount of numbers, letters, whatever that's inside of a quotation mark. Okay, that's it's simple as I can try and make it sound. It's just basically any type of text. Okay. And then, so obviously when you call a method, you gotta use parentheses, similar to how there's parentheses when you define a function. You need to use parentheses when you call a function, and that's what it's called. When you call a function is when you do it. Okay? You also notice I use this semicolon. After every single line in a C#, there's gonna be a semicolon. Obviously there's not one for curly braces, but you notice up here there's semicolons, semicolon here. That's just basically saying new line, and that's the same reason why it doesn't matter whether I put this curly brace up here or up here, because when I compile this code, it's interpreted like this. It really doesn't even matter until here when it notices, wow, that's a semicolon, new line. Basically, I could compile this; it'd be runnable code. Obviously, it's not very easy to read, so I'm going to go ahead and fix this. Okay, so if we hit save, so navigate back to our Unity window, it should take a second and recompile. You can check that it did if you click on it and go back to our inspector. You can see our code is in there. Now, to attach the script to a game object, all you gotta do is click on it in your project view and drag it onto your main camera. If you click on your main camera, you'll notice at the bottom here a new component is attached called test, and it's a script. And if we hit run, that start method should be called. And you'll see at the bottom it says hello world. Click on it, it'll go to our console, and it says hello world. Okay, so pretty simple, right? Next, our update function. This is something that's called per frame. So let's do debug.log. We'll call it tick. Hit save, reload, run. You'll notice at the very beginning it said hello world, and since then it's been ticking. And you'll notice the number is increasing every time a frame passes. Okay. So this is fine and dandy, but let's say the next thing I want to cover is we already kind of discussed strings, which are text values. Next thing I want to talk about are number values, and there's several different types of number values as opposed to there's only one type of. Well, actually, there's two different types of string values, but we don't need to go into characters right yet. But several different types of number values, and the most common is the integer. So also, I'm going to explain what properties are. Properties are anything that is outside of a method, but inside of a class. So like stuff that's in this space, that could be considered a property. So let's make a new property, okay? First, when you make a new property, you start by typing in its type, and we want an integer. So let's type in int. And if you don't know what an integer is, if you need a refresher for a math class, an integer is any number that doesn't have a decimal. So like 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and it could go in the negatives as well. Integer, then after to tell what type it is, you have to type in the name of this variable. Let's call this my first integer. And if you wanted to, you can just hit semicolon and end the line there. That's called defining our integer. On top of this, we could also create an accessor for this if we want to, because by default it's private by default. But if we want to, we want this to be viewable within the engine and viewable by other code. Let's make it public. So now we have a public int my first integer. Now this is another something that you can do is when you load up this code, my first integer, although we have it defined, we don't have it initialized. And what that means is right now its value is null, which means nothing. It's not 0, but nothing. Like if you tried to reference it, it would throw an error because there's nothing in there. But if you want to, we can make a default value for this. So this is the value that it will be when it first loads up. And the way you do that is by typing it equal, and then let's make it, I don't know, 1. Okay? So there we go. We've now officially defined our first property. It is a public integer called the myFirstInteger, and by default it's going to be 1. Okay? Now let's just do some simple mathematics. This is what we call operators within C#. There's different types of operators we can use. I'll make a comment down here. The operators are plus, minus, minus, well, okay, we'll start with just plus and minus, okay? And times and divide, but there are other things that return Boolean values, which I'll explain a bit later. Which actually, I think it's easier than mathematic operators usually, but we'll go there later. These are the 4 basic operations you can do to numbers: plus, minus, multiply, and subtract, and divide. Okay, so it's it's simple as you would think it would be. So let's do debug.log, and inside here let's put my first integer dot toString space I don't want to go this far, but put a plus. I'll explain in a little bit. This is kind of confusing, but I'll explain it. Then put a parenthesis mark, put is the value, and then end quotation mark. So what this is first we're logging my first integer, but you're noticing we're calling toString on it. And what that is by default, remember we just said its type is an integer, but debug.log only takes in a string. So we're taking this integer and converting it to a string. And then I don't want to go into this because this is a plus, but it's a different plus than what I wanted to talk about. This is when you join together variables, and we're adding to this is the value as a string. So now this entire thing should be my first integer is the value, but instead of saying my first integer, it should output the actual number. Okay, let's delete our tick too, just so it's not flooded. Okay, and then also, why don't we go ahead and down here, remember this is called every frame, we'll do my first integer equals my first integer plus 1. Simple enough, right? So every frame we're going to take this variable. It's called a variable, by the way. I said property, but properties are also referred to as variables, because all variables are properties, but not all properties are variables. So every frame we're taking this integer and we're adding 1 to it. Another way of putting this is go up here, make a second comment, plus equals and minus equals, or minus equals. The main reason for these two is because it got kind of it was kind of a pain to put this equals the same thing plus 1. Instead of that, you can just go ahead and do this, my first integer plus equals 1. So now I don't have to retype my first integer. And yet another way, a third way of doing this is like so, my first integer plus plus, and that just defaults it to add 1 to it. So all three of these lines mean the exact same thing. You can choose whichever one you want, it should work. And the same goes for subtracting. You know, my first integer equals my first integer minus 1, my first integer minus equals 1, and we have my first integer minus minus. Okay, let's go ahead and I'm going to comment all of these out and leave this first one here. And so now if we run this code, it should print this value to the console every frame, but add 1 to it. So let's go ahead and test this. And as you can see, the number is getting larger every single frame. Alrighty, I'm going to go ahead and end this tutorial here. Within the next tutorials, I plan to do explain Boolean values, or Boolean variables and Boolean operators, and then perhaps maybe float values as well, which is another number type. And then after that, we'll actually start to do some game programming. Alright, so until then, I'll see you guys next time.